must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.
It is ridiculous and it is against the laws of nature that we can have somebody sitting pretty who takes home more money than the credible entrepreneur who is doing actual production of goods and services.
We always say it as it is.
It is only in this country that when a thief is arrested, you hear elders from their tribe saying, "He is our son and he is our thief."
If you are deviant
Yes.
and I call you leader, probably you are already a leader, but you are leading in the wrong direction.
We want to see the role of the youth
Yeah.
in the security,
Yes.
governance,
Yes.
and development.
The youth that I meet and work with here, you know, we call them the millennials and X's and Y's, this and that. They don't necessarily want to live like their fathers and grandfathers,
Yes.
do business like their fathers and grandfathers. They're more independent, they're better educated, and they're the ones that are making everything move in this region.
We look at the issues, we talk about issues that impact people's lives in Africa.
The African peoples themselves continue to cheer bad leaders, and because they cheer them on, they continue to be misled.
Let me ask you, doctor, would you rather be somebody who does not enjoy so much freedom but you are rich?
Yes.
Or you'd rather be poor who you are actually imprisoned by the poverty itself?
My goal is not to come here and say, I want the majority ownership, I want to own this, I want to own that, I want to do this. My goal is we all make money and we're all happy, and I help build a big business here.
Punchline is for Africa, with Africa, from Africa.
We discuss Africa. We see what ails Africa. And today, this afternoon, we want to see whether Sudan will permanently remain a sick child of Africa. Is it a permanent sickness? Can we resolve the issues of Southern Sudan? Is it something that has gone wrong for 200 years? There has always been a problem in Southern Sudan, in that great region, starting from all the way the Alimadi Wars and the rest of all what happened until today. Peace seems to be elusive. Why has UN taken slow action? Why hasn't UN set up a tribunal? We want to see a tribunal that will make sure that Southern Sudan people are accountable. Those who committed crimes against the human beings. 20,000 Sudanese perished. They are perished. They are not accountable. Nobody can account for them. And we cannot sit here, go on hammering peace agreements without mechanisms of accountability. If we set a tribunal for Sierra Leone, for Rwanda, for Camera Rouge, we need somebody to stand up for the poor masses, the masses that have died, the masses that continue to die, the masses that are being brutalized, murdered, maimed on a daily basis by marauding armies of both Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. There must be an accountability. You are not going to sit here and tell people there is no accountability in Southern Sudan. There must be a tribunal. Why do we run to harass countries of Kenya, put ICC on Kenya, put ICC on this country, put ICC on Central African Republic? Why have we delayed on putting a tribunal for Southern Sudan to find out who is killing, who has been killing, how they have been killing people? Let me speak for the people in Southern Sudan, the women, the children who have not gone to school, the children who have no medicine, the children who have nothing, who have been running since 2013, and the war cannot end because of two people. Let them face the tribunal. I'm not going to keep quiet as a Pan-African to see Southern Sudan being maimed, being tortured, being cut, dismembered, and we keep quiet and watch people got images of people, of malcontents singing to us in Uganda, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, telling us they have money. Let them face the international tribunal and tell the tribunal who gave them the guns, where they buying them, how they were killing people. Enough is enough. Enough is enough for Africa. We have had enough. There is no need of that anymore. Enough is enough. And if people have died, they will not cry. We people who are left on planet Earth must cry for them. We must find justice for them. We must make sure that there are leaders who go on bragging on television stations all over the world who are accountable. They must be behind bars.
Television broadcasting all the way from Nairobi, simultaneous to entire world. Wherever you are being picked by our satellite in Bahrain, and then our satellites will also cross over all over the African cities and countries. In America, those waking up, good morning. Good morning in Vancouver, where President Uhuru Kenyatta is right now. Thank you very much, viewers, for watching us. Thank you very much for watching this show, The People's Court. The People's Court brings out typical issues, very important issues on the continent of Africa. We choose one. The country we are choosing today is Zimbabwe. As you know very well, Zimbabwe has been our country. Zimbabwe is a country that we have struggled so hard to defend. And we have made it a priority that one day, and one day alone, sanctions will be removed on this great country of Africa. Today we shall be honored to host one of our Pan-Africanists who is a Zimbabwean himself. He is based in Harare, but he's in South Africa. From the location where he is going to talk to us about sanctions, about the United States of America lumping sanctions on Zimbabwe. Have the sanctions worked? Have the sanctions removed the regime? The sanctions were put there targeted to target individuals. There are no sanctions that target individuals in third world countries. Sanctions target the masses. Whether one sanction or one type of embargo, all these sanctions target the masses of Zimbabwe. As you are aware, Zimbabwe has suffered a great deal as a result of these obnoxious laws that were put there by America as a result of the agricultural revolution that took place in Zimbabwe in 1997. For most of you who don't know the history of Zimbabwe, I would like to tell you the Lancaster Agreement was done in the United Kingdom, and there was given 15 years that the government of Zimbabwe should not change a comma on that Lancaster Agreement. From 1980 to 1995, the government of Zimbabwe kept on saying, we need to talk about the land reforms. In 1997, changes took place in Britain. Britain got a new prime minister by name Tony Blair. 1998, he swept to power. He became the Labour Party leader and the Prime Minister of Britain. The Conservative government of Britain had actually kept its promise, willing buyer, willing seller, and the compensation programs that a black empowerment project would take place in Zimbabwe. And they did so. That's why the John Major, Margaret Thatcher were able to contain the situation of those 4,000 commercial white farmers were able to sell if they wanted their land, and they could be compensated by the Great Britain. Unfortunately, when Tony Blair took over power, he nullified each and everything that had been done by the Conservative government. It is from here that Zimbabwe started bleeding. It is from here that Zimbabwe had a problem. It is here that the situation became very murky for the people of Zimbabwe, for the government of President Robert Mugabe. Viewers, we might be having difficulty, but we are bringing in our guest from the studios in Southern Africa, who is going to talk to us, and I will allow him to discuss the Zimbabwe Unite Action Group that has come up to say Zimbabweans to unite against sanctions, the United States sanctions against Zimbabwe. I'm going through the background of this topic as to why today we are talking about Zimbabwe, as to why today the country of Zimbabwe has been demonized, as why today the people of Zimbabwe have economic hardships, as why today we look at Zimbabwe and see a country that was once feeding itself. Today, Zimbabwe economically has been crippled by targeted sanctions, and the sanctions that have increased with American administration, heaping more and more sanctions. Yet, these sanctions have not achieved the aim that they wanted to achieve. The sanctions in Zimbabwe have punished the local people, the citizens of Zimbabwe, the masses of Zimbabwe, the people, the children in hospitals, those who are dying of diseases that are curable. The people of Zimbabwe, the people of Africa must stand up and say no, enough is enough on the question of sanctions. Continue the sanctions against the government of Zimbabwe does not pay at all. There are reforms, there are democratic reforms that have been made. There are gains that have been made. The people of Zimbabwe, therefore, have a right to stand up and claim their country. They have to claim their country, remove sanctions, tell America. Africa should stand up, tell America. Africa should stand up, warn America to remove sanctions. Extension of sanctions on a country that is already bleeding is like a terrorism. Extending sanctions on a country that is already crippled economically is the highest degree of terrorism that anybody could talk about, worse than that is what is happening in Somalia. Viewers, I am not intimidated. Neither shall I or shall we be intimidated to be quiet, to be silent when our brothers in Zimbabwe are dying of curable diseases that can be cured by the medicines in hospitals, allowing these medicines freely, allowing the travel of all the participants in the governance of the people of Zimbabwe. It is therefore my honor right now to cross over to South Africa to bring in my guest. My guest will do the introduction. He's not very new. Most of you have seen him. He's an active young man, not old like myself. I have done quite a lot of work since 1999, when I stood in the Labour conference in Britain and I put up my hand in the Labour conference and disagreed with Tony Blair. I have been on the move. I have never spared the European type of sanctions against Zimbabwe. Those ones we succeeded, they were removed, but still we have a few of other hardships, and the hardships are coming from the United States of America. The United States of America, before I bring in my guest, is also sponsoring regime change plus violent overthrow of governments in Africa. I have not spared them either. I have not spared the French who maraud this continent, the French who walk from one country to another, a proxy war that is in East Africa today. As we look at Somalia, from Somalia, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, the French have come. You don't rule out the French hand in the Zimbabwe regime change. They are paying, they are equipping, they are logistically paying people through surrogates of imperialism to overthrow the government of Emerson Mnangagwa. Truth be said, stand by the truth, tell it as it is. We have no love for those malcontents who are walking around the continent spreading a regime change tactics, violence from one country to another country. As I speak today, Uganda and Rwanda, brother and brother, sister and sister, we can't travel to Rwanda. We can't travel to Uganda from Rwanda. Who has brought this division? The French. As I speak today, Kenya is having difficulties with Somalia. Who has brought these difficulties? The French. As I speak today, in Democratic Republic of Congo, Tshisekedi is on a knife hanger politics. Who has brought these discussions? The French. As I speak today, the problems of Khartoum in Sudan, who has brought this problem? Who funded the demonstrators? You can see the demonstrators in Khartoum are stuck on the streets, yet they have achieved the aim of removing Bashir. Somebody is ordering them, equipping them, paying them from Jamena, from Chad. The Chad president, Idris Habdi, is a mercenary of the French neocolonialism on the continent. The Secretary General or the chairperson of African Union, who is himself a Chadian man, cannot tell us that you can watch the troops of General Haftar, Khalifa, crossing from Benghazi, going to tackle to overthrow a government that African Union has recognized in Tripoli. The French, look at that. Africans, look at that. With that, introduction, a hot introduction, heated introduction. I bring in the young man himself, Mr. Rutendo Matanyare, all the way from South Africa. Good afternoon, brother.
Good afternoon, doctor. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. I think I've warmed you up. I want you now to start by introducing yourself live to the world. You are being listened to through our sister stations, satellite systems through Berlin. We have a satellite system through Berlin. It's beaming our interview live. I want you to tell the world who you are, what you want to do on the question of removing sanctions against Zimbabwe. Go ahead, brother. Take it away.
Right. My name is Rutendo Matinyarare Bereza. I come from Zimbabwe. And I'm a young man that is very passionate about Africa, passionate about us destroying neoliberalism, neocolonialism on the African continent, because it has become the continuation of colonialism on the African continent. And I would also like to be one of those people that stand up to give consciousness to blackness that our war and struggle against imperialism, our war and struggle against colonialism and white domination has never ended, even though we got political independence. In fact, we might even say that now we're in a position where we have got a bigger fight on our hands because the enemy is no longer obvious. And like what Kwame Nkrumah said, once neocolonialism starts taking place, you are not able to identify the true enemy, and then you begin to see your brothers and sisters as your enemies, causing us to fight each other instead of uniting against this white supremacy and the continuation of white colonialism on the African continent.
Thank you very much, Rutendo. I will prefer calling you that name, Rutendo. You must be coming from Mashingo or somewhere near that area of before you reach Midlands. I know a lot about Zimbabwe. Thank you very much. From 1966, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2005, 2008, 2009, and to date, sanctions have been put on Zimbabwe in various formats. The 66 sanctions is because of unilateral declaration of independence by Ian Smith that they put sanctions, and the rest have come as a result of the MDC themselves asking, especially the one that I tackled in Europe. It was Morgan Changarai who asked for these sanctions. They went out to drum sanctions against the same country, the same people that they wanted to rule. The sanctions have continued in 2019. The MDC themselves have gone out again to tell Americans that it's not yet good. So I want to pose my first question. Are we bewitched? Are we Africans bewitched? Are we from Zimbabwe? We call for sanctions. From other African countries, we run to these people. Call, say, come and finish all the people in Bindura, all the people in Lupane, all the people in Kariba Dam, all the people in Livingstone, Victoria Falls, finish them. Then you come and say, I want to lead. Will you lead animals? Take it away.
Yes, well, thank you very much again, Doctor, because this is the same issue that we've been raising, that when MDC go and they campaign for sanctions against their own people, they are basically perpetuating a continuation of colonialism. And like you said, that the initial sanctions that were on this country came when Ian Smith declared unilateral independence in Rhodesia. But we actually believe that those sanctions actually started when colonialism started in Zimbabwe. They started with the coming of the white man in 1889, and him taking our land. And that was the beginning of sanctions. That was the beginning of the dispossession of black people through the use of violence and economic exclusion. That economic exclusion then culminated in the Rhodesians themselves wanting to call for independence from England, because they believed that they were serving England's interests. Their resources of Rhodesia were being taken by them to be able to sustain England. And they decided that they wanted Rhodesian resources, which were Zimbabwean resources, to be utilized to better the whites that were staying in Rhodesia at the time. So they declared independence. That declaration of independence meant that the British did not have unfettered access to the resources of Rhodesia. They did not have unfettered access to the slave labor and the black people that were being exploited for the benefit of growing England. And for that reason, they came together as the United Nations under the cover of trying to support human rights in Zimbabwe and supposedly the human rights of the black people in Zimbabwe. But the truth of the matter is that England wanted to take control of Rhodesia and its resources, its labor, for the benefit of England. Eventually, those sanctions culminated in a war of liberation. That war of liberation supposedly crippled the Rhodesians from being able to continue holding on to power, and eventually there was a change in government in 1980. But what we must also stress is that even though there were sanctions on Rhodesia, we had agreements like the Bide Act that was passed in the US Congress to continue to trade with Rhodesia. We had countries like South Africa, Israel, Brazil, Switzerland, Japan, Jordan, and a number of other European countries like Italy that did not have sanctions when those sanctions were imposed. This is why we saw the Kariba Dam was able to be developed and was able to get loans after sanctions had already been imposed on Rhodesia, because the white community, the European community, still wanted to sustain the Ian Smith government from being totally defeated to negotiate a settlement under defeat. So they were propped up. Weapons continued to come from the countries that were not imposing these sanctions. South Africa continued to be used as a conduit. The Bide Act that was signed by the Congress of the United States continued to allow Rhodesia to trade chrome and to trade some of its resources, with Switzerland being used for the passing of funds and even the sales of aircraft and weapons to Rhodesia, even though the United Nations had imposed very stringent sanctions that should have stopped Rhodesia from being able to transact and should have collapsed Rhodesia. We then get independence. A lot of people believe that that independence was a fulfillment of what the United Nations was looking for, which is the passing of human rights to the black people of Zimbabwe, self-determination, and the ability to self-govern. But when you look at the Lancaster House Conference, when you look at how the Lancaster House Conference was negotiated, when you look at the fact that the Zimbabwean liberation fighters were still willing to be fighting in the bush to defeat the Rhodesians before they went to negotiate, but the British government, Henry Kissinger, the Americans, forced the liberation fighters to go and negotiate, sit at the table to negotiate with Ian Smith for the passing of power so that they could not get total victory in the bush. With that, we had an agreement that forced our government to compensate white farmers for any land that they did not want. Our government would have had to buy that land would be bought in foreign currency in what was known as a willing buyer, willing seller agreement.
Yes.
It was the...
Thank you. Go ahead. I'm just complimenting. Yes.
Right. It was then agreed that the willing buyer, willing seller agreement would allow the status quo that was Rhodesia to maintain itself. The whites will continue to hold the factors of production. They will continue to control resources and minerals. They'll continue to control mining, and they'll continue to control the land that they had before colonialism was defeated. And if they wanted to sell land, then the government would have to buy that land on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. So basically, we're the maintenance of colonialism in the same way we see that maintenance of colonialism in South Africa under a black leadership. Now, they then agreed, because Robert Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo were not accept any settlement that did not talk about land, because the reason why our fighters had gone to fight for liberation is they wanted to get back the control of the land, the control of resources, so that they can be able to utilize those resources for the betterment of the rest of Zimbabwe. Another thing is that for Zimbabwe to be able to undertake this purchase of this land, this purchase of this land that the white farmers did not want within the first 10 years, Zimbabwe would have to utilize money from its fiscus, money that has been collected from the economic activity of the country as agreed at the Lancaster House Conference. Zimbabwe would also have to develop the services and basic services that were supposed to be delivered by the colonizer before the independence, according to the Isescri Treaty, by taking loans from the World Bank, from the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And that loan would be taken by the government of Zimbabwe on behalf of a colonizer that did not give people schools, education, electricity, roads, bridges, and other basic services that had been mandated by the 1971 Isescri Treaty and the decolonization agenda, together with the Human Rights Charter. So now, already Zimbabwe was in a fix where they needed to come a new government that was going to take loans to develop what the colonizer was supposed to develop, yet it never got reparations. Zimbabwe is then also supposed to utilize the little money that it had in its fiscus, not to develop the lives of the people who had been prejudiced by colonialism, but they then had to use that money to pay white farmers in foreign currency for the return of land that was stolen by the white farmers. Now, a lot of us who understand law will understand that automatically there had been a legitimization of the stealing of black land or Zimbabwean land from black people the moment our government agreed to compensate those white farmers for the return of stolen property.
Yes.
And we would also understand that common law usually says that the law cannot legitimize an illegality, and stolen property can never become legal or have legal title over time. But anyway, Robert Mugabe, together with Joshua Nkomo, were forced to accept those terms on the understanding that after 10 years, the government of Zimbabwe could change the constitution. It could then change the Land Appropriation Act and allow for the appropriation of land according to what land the government required. And the government could then also change that constitution to serve whatever needs it required on how that land would be acquired and valued. Because previously, in the willing buyer, willing seller, a farmer would sell land that was valued by private valuation companies that were mainly white and be compensated in foreign currency.
Okay.
Mugabe was...
Let's hold it there, Mr. Rutendo. Mr. Rutendo, that background is fantastic. And that's the background that makes most of the younger generation today in Zimbabwe. It's good you brought it up so that we know where the difficulties came from. Because most of the younger generation on Twitter, social media, and other avenues really don't know the background, why sanctions, why we have reached where we are today. And that is very good for your organization, which you intend to inaugurate, which you have inaugurated to fight sanctions against Zimbabwe from the United States. Let's come direct to the questions, because here I don't tell bit about the bush. I go straight to the point. American sanctions against Zimbabwe is like a terrorism in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Central African Republic, in Egypt, in Libya. It's just sanctions are equally as ruthless as terrorists. So in 2001, Americans introduced what we call Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Policy Recovery Act, commonly called as ZIDERA. Now, in ZIDERA, there is no concessions that we have ever received from America. All what we receive from America are hardening positions. What do you think your organization now, Zimbabwe Unite Against USA Sanctions, that you are pushed internationally and you're being watched in millions of people, and these tapes video will be replayed on several television stations worldwide? What do you want the message to go to America? What do you want to tell United States of America president on the sanctions against Zimbabwe?
A lot of times when people talk about ZIDERA and concessions, they seem to be justifying this act of trying to diminish the sovereignty of Zimbabwe. We say that unequivocally, the ZIDERA sanctions are illegal because they are an interference of a foreign country upon the sovereign state of Zimbabwe, and it is an attempt to force Zimbabwe to change its policies in order to favor US interests on the African continent. That is problematic. It is illegal according to the UN Charter, to which Zimbabwe and the United States are both signatories. The fact that those sanctions then also include our previous colonial masters, which are Europe, England involved in there, and then the Australians together with the Canadians, is a symbolism that the white world has decided to pit itself against the nation of Zimbabwe. That is illegal. That is hegemony. That is suzerainty. And when you look at the terms that were put in those particular sanctions in the document that was known as S494, they were very clear to stipulate that the objective of those sanctions was to bring democratic change to Zimbabwe. And it was to bring democratic change to Zimbabwe by stopping Zimbabwean institutions, the Zimbabwean government, which includes all the ministries that are supposed to give services to Zimbabweans, access to international debt, access to the multilateral lending institutions, removing colonial debt or any other debts that Zimbabwe incurred in order for it to normalize the country after 90 years of colonialism. So for me, the moment that we have ZIDERA, and the moment that ZIDERA stops Zimbabwe from getting loans to develop Zimbabwe from the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, it is a circumvention of the agreements that were made in Lancaster.
Yes.
It is a circumvention of the agreements that said in Lancaster that Zimbabwe will be given financial assistance. It shall be given loans, and some of those loans shall be cancelled so that Zimbabwe can develop itself from the oppression of colonialism that took 90 years, this illegal act, this crime against humanity that was British colonialism in Zimbabwe, for which Zimbabwe did not receive reparations. It also meant that Zimbabwe would have been able to claim some of the money that it had to use to buy back stolen land from the United Kingdom through these institutions. The moment that ZIDERA was put, it meant that England, which did not pay reparations to the Zimbabwean people, England, which benefited from colonialism but did not compensate Zimbabweans for the colonial pillage, had gotten away scot-free while Zimbabwe was compensating the very same people that had stolen the land.
Okay.
So ZIDERA is illegal. ZIDERA is a contravention of international law. ZIDERA is a contravention of Human Rights Charter. ZIDERA is a contravention of the ICESCR Treaty. ZIDERA is a contravention of the UN Charter that is supposed to see countries self-determining, independence, self-determination, and economic freedom.
Rutendo, thank you very much. I would like to ask, today, the situation in Zimbabwe economically is not very good. Is that true?
That is true.
The government of President Emerson Mnangagwa has tried its level-based, has managed to succeeded in Europe to have some sanctions go. Is that true?
That is true, but the problem with having sanctions in Europe gone, while there's still a maintenance.
I'm coming.
Maintenance. Okay.
I'm giving you a full question. I agree with you. The sanctions in Europe have gone. The only obstacle that remains is Zidera sanctions. That is the American sanctions. I want to bring you back on that, the American sanction, United States sanctions. Because once United States in the world coughs, the rest of the world catches cold. United States refuses IMF. IMF will not come your side. World Bank will not come. Remember, they are the biggest shareholders of World Bank and the IMF. They are the biggest holders of all lending and trade all over the whole world. You have seen the way they have molested China, putting sanctions on China's goods, because at night they go to borrow money in China. During daytime, they say China is very bad. But at night, America borrows money from China. But look, given that Zidera is affecting the people of Zimbabwe, is dehumanizing them, making them beggars within their own country, making them look like they can have nothing, yet Zimbabwe themselves, if allowed to sell their products freely through channels, they will regain the integrity they had. What action do you think your organization, Zimbabwe Unite organization, against sanctions, what action do you intend to do to force the American government to understand and listen to the government of Zimbabwe that sanctions from America must be lifted? What are your time frames? What are your action? What plans? What do you intend to do? Do you intend to mobilize a petition? Do you intend to file a case in the court? Do you intend to ask the United States ambassador in Harare to tell us why he should stay in Harare enjoying the food, the suffering of the people of Zimbabwe, yet his country has put Zimbabwe on sanctions? What are your actions?
Before I tell you what my actions are, I just wanted to also correct something. So we've got the Zidera sanctions that initially stopped Zimbabwe from getting loans from the multilateral lending institutions. But there is a set of sanctions that have been created that are not given much ventilation in the media, which I would like to highlight right now. We've got what are called the executive order sanctions that were imposed in 2003 by George Bush, extended in 2005, and then extended again in 2008. These sanctions are called EO 13469. They initially started as EO 13288, and they were extended into EO 1391. These are the sanctions that are affecting Zimbabwe from trading with the rest of the world. These are the sanctions that have been targeted on what have been called the 144 special designated nationals, who include the government of Zimbabwe, its companies, there's private institutions, banking institutions, private companies, our seed and fertilizer manufacturing companies. These were the sanctions that are affecting Zimbabwe more because they stop Zimbabwe from reindustrializing. They stop any American company or any other company in the world from trading with Zimbabwe and offering Zimbabwe services,
yes,
offering Zimbabwe software, offering Zimbabwe machinery, selling Zimbabwe any product. And that is what has crippled the Zimbabwean industry, which can no longer get loans, which cannot buy machinery, which cannot get software, which cannot get any services from any company in the world, because if it's given any of those services, that company goes under sanctions. And these are the sanctions that are stopping economic development in Zimbabwe. And where a Zimbabwean company is able to get economic development, where it is able to start trading with the world, they have also targeted that any transactions in US dollars, which must pass through the US system or financial system, which must pass through the Bank of International Settlements, which must pass through the SWIFT system, will be blocked if it is going to any companies that can be linked to having been done business with the government of Zimbabwe, or the banking institutions that have been isolated, or the 144 companies. So the sanctions were designed in such a way that they cannot be predictable. You cannot really see who is sanctioned in Zimbabwe, but ultimately, the whole of Zimbabwe's government sector, its business sector, its financial sector have been isolated to the extent that 108 banks, what we call partner banks across the world, the major banks that are supposed to facilitate international trade, have decoupled themselves from Zimbabwe, leaving only 9 partner banks to trade with Zimbabwe, and a lot of them are inconsequential banks, isolating Zimbabwe financially through payment systems, ability to be able to buy inputs for its industry. That is affecting jobs. So what am I supposed to do? What do we want to do as the Zimbabwe is united against US war sanctions? Our very first agenda is to create information. One of the problems that is in Zimbabwe is that people in Zimbabwe do not understand the sanctions. People in Zimbabwe do not even understand the fact that the country is under sanctions and that all the economic problems that we have in the country are caused by these economic sanctions, which we have decided to call war sanctions. Because they are war sanctions, they blockade the country, they embargo the country, and they stop the country from developing so that the citizens themselves are collectively punished. And after they are collectively punished, they are forced to overthrow their own government because of its inability to deliver services to the people. It is our job to inform people that your government is under sanctions. Its ministries that are supposed to deliver services, social services, healthcare, education, roads, infrastructure, and the development of small businesses have been held back by the sanctions. It's our job to inform people that their government, their banking, and their industry is also under the same sanctions, to stop it from trading, to stop it from being able to sell its commodities and goods, and that is stopping the creation of jobs in Zimbabwe. Once people know this, we then want these people to understand that their country is at war, and we need to take war measures. We need to take national security measures to protect the country from these activities. How do we do this? We need to change our economic outlook to stop waiting for foreign investment to come into Zimbabwe and become the engine of developing Zimbabwe. We need the Zimbabwean diaspora to be how we raise our capital to be able to invest in being able to exploit and leverage our resources for us to process them in Zimbabwe, instead of letting American companies control them and take it out on their terms. We as Zimbabweans have got to be the starters of industry for the problems that are in Zimbabwe, and we have to learn to start lobbying other African countries to understand our position so that they can trade with us and stand with us against the United States hegemony in Zimbabwe. We also intend to lobby other pressure groups, civil society groups, human rights groups in Zimbabwe, in Africa, and also those outside Africa, to tell them that the United States is imposing warfare on a small little country to stop it from developing so that they can have monopoly over the land and resources of that country and to give them over to the control of US companies. That is colonialism once again. Very few people in the world know that there is colonialism being reinstituted on Zimbabwe, and that Zimbabwe is being utilized as an example to the rest of Africa, countries like South Africa, countries like Kenya, countries like Namibia, that if they attempt to decolonize, if they attempt to take their land from the control of Western companies, to take their resources from the control of Western companies, they will be punished and isolated the way that Zimbabwe was. So our first objective is to bring unity in Zimbabwe. We cannot expect Africa to stand up for Zimbabwe if Zimbabweans themselves are not standing up against these sanctions. We cannot expect Africa to stand up for Zimbabwe until Zimbabweans unite and then begin to ask other African countries to unite with us, to then go back to the United States and challenge them to say, if you are going to come into Africa, you come either to partner, but if you are coming to reinstitute colonialism, if you are coming to put AFRICOM, if you're coming to isolate economies like Zimbabwe, as you did with Libya, as you did with Somalia, as you are doing with Guinea, we are not going to allow you to have your embassies in Africa. We would rather you pack up and go back home rather than for you to have embassies in our continent without good relationships with us. Now, that's ironically is that America has just built a $300 million embassy in Harare after 18 years of sanctions upon the Zimbabwean people, after destroying the lives of widows, orphans, creating more orphans, destroying the lives of the poor. They still have a nerve to build a $300 million embassy and say that they have a good relationship with Zimbabwe, which is a lie, and it is our responsibility as Zwaus, it is our responsibility as a Zimbabwean institution that understands the hegemony on Zimbabwe to spell out the kind of colonialism and warfare that the United States is instituting on the people of Zimbabwe, so that the people of Zimbabwe can start to stand up against this hegemony.
Okay. Thank you very much. You have outlined your mission statement, what you intend to do, how you intend to go about it. Africa is ready to help. We are ready to help. Most of us, most of the countries in Africa don't understand the situation in Zimbabwe. It is very important, therefore, for you to explain as you have done on a continuous daily basis, hourly basis, such that the message sinks. There is one element I want to ask you. The regime change that is cropping up, the support that is being given to opposition parties in Africa, the support all ranging from West Africa down to South Africa. Opposition parties, look at the one in Malawi. Already they are up on the street. They want to change because elections were rigged. Back in Uganda, they want to change, supported by George Soros' Open Society Foundation. In Kenya, the same. In DRC Congo, they failed because Tshisekedi won. They were surprised that their preferred candidate did not go through. In Zimbabwe, Chamisa, day in, day out, is calling upon the younger generation, together with Professor Jonathan Moyo and others, for regime change. I believe the American sanctions are intentionally left there to force this country called Zimbabwe to go into hardship, then bring the people on the streets. Do you agree with me?
I agree with you, but before we put all the blame on opposition parties in Africa, we also have to acknowledge that the ruling parties are also complicit with the problems that we're seeing in Africa and the problems that manifest in these particular sanctions. And I'll give you a number of examples. There were sanctions that were put on Muammar Gaddafi and Libya. And those sanctions were put specifically because Muammar Gaddafi nationalized the oil of Libya and utilized that oil to better his people and was beginning to utilize that money to also take Africa forward. He put a satellite into space, utilizing fund for an African satellite. He was beginning to use this money to develop projects on the African continent, and Gaddafi was removed. And he was removed with the assistance of the South African government together with the Nigerian government. Those presidents were complicit in the destruction of Libya, which ultimately left Africa destroyed because it no longer had this financial power that was Libya on the African continent. When you look at the Zimbabwe situation was partially caused because of the land reform program, but it was particularly caused by the fact that Zimbabwe had to go into Congo to stop the overthrow of Laurent Kabila by rebels that were coming from Uganda and rebels that were coming from Rwanda. Rwanda was complicit, utilizing its own military to put in rebels to overthrow a leader in Congo because he would not acquiesce to the interests of the American companies and the interests of the European powers that were trying to take resources out of Congo. Zimbabwe was especially sanctioned to weaken its military, especially sanctioned to ensure that in future, when there's meddling by American powers through rebels on the African continent, Zimbabwe would not be active in fighting that. They had known that Zimbabwe was willing to fight imperialism because they had gone to Mozambique to liberate Mozambique from the attacks that were being induced by the apartheid government, South African forces that were financing the Matsanga in Mozambique. So our leaders have been complicit with the European neo-colonial agenda, and that neo-colonial agenda is the one that has resulted in sanctions. And the South African government, when there were sanctions on Zimbabwe, they allowed illicit flows of capital to leave Zimbabwe into South African banks. They did not use FICA to stop the white people that were what we call laundering money from Zimbabwe, ill-gotten gains that were achieved through colonialism, that were achieved through exploitation of our labor. It was allowed to go into South Africa without any hindrance. When Zimbabwe went into Congo, South Africa stood on the side together with Zambia, Mozambique, and other SADC countries, instead of holding hands as SADC, going in to fight these rebels to ensure that Congo is liberated. Then when we leave that, we also come to the structures that have been created that our leaders have signed to. In SADC, we had something called the SADC Protocol. This SADC Protocol had a court that presided on ensuring that it dealt with SADC disputes. But this particular court judged against the government of Zimbabwe for taking land in decolonization. That means that we had this SADC tribunal, this body of legal body that was instituting colonial policy, colonial laws. And our leaders are complicit in the aspect that they did not break down the Roman Dutch law, English law, and French law systems that were on the African continent being used to colonize us. So what that did is that we continued to be colonized by the systems left by our colonizer, by the systems of education, systems of law, and systems of administration that we have taken forward, rendering us colonies by the system. That is the complicity of our leaders. In Zimbabwe, the government of Zimbabwe has never called for a state of emergency. They have never called for what is called emergency powers against these sanctions. Yet the United States government declared a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. Why have our leaders in Zimbabwe not called for a national emergency, a state of emergency against these sanctions, so that a national strategy, a national effort can be focused on creating awareness about the sanctions and looking for methods to mitigate? So by the time we start having these opposition parties that you talked about, they are only being empowered by a failure of our governments, a failure of the incumbent leaders to tackle national security issues. By now in Zimbabwe, Nelson Chamisa should be in jail if we had national security, if we had a national emergency against sanctions. The support for sanctions would be illegalized. The support for sanctions would become treasonous. The support for sanctions would be criminalized, in the same way that in the United States they criminalized communism. In the United States they've criminalized anything that is unpatriotic and things that go against the U.S. Patriotic Act. Why haven't we done the same in Africa? So the last thing is that we talk about these non-governmental organizations, civil society groups that only can survive by serving the agendas of their funders and the agendas of those that promote them, like the Soros Foundation. That is a symbol of an Africa that has got no economic activities. It is a symbol of an Africa where lawyers are the people who can only earn money through undertaking the agenda of foreign nations, because there's no economic activity for them to be able to be legal firms and successful legal people in serving commercial agendas in the country. That in itself is a sign that we've got an economic threat or national security problem in our economic activities. it is our responsibility as government and non-governmental organizations to educate our people that when you are dependent on loans, when you are dependent on donor funds to destabilize your country, it is a sign that already you've been sabotaged from an economic level to be able to sustain yourself. And as a nation, we must come together. As a continent, we must come together and unite to develop economies that make us economically viable and successful without sabotaging our countries or becoming politicians.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rutendo. I just want to give you closing remarks. On closing remarks, I would ask, we have got quite a lot of feedback here. Of course, most of your Zimbabwean brothers, some of them are very hostile, but don't give up, because most of the problems that Zimbabweans have is that they know how to insult using English, but they have lacked patriotism, especially those who eat hamburger in London and the United States of America. They lump quite a lot of insults when you talk in the name of ZANU-PF or protecting Zimbabwe. Most of them are saying they want ZANU-PF gone. I have seen quite a lot of them online. They have come for you. But you have also got equally very many people saying that sanctions must go. And that is the beginning of it. This is the beginning of what we have to do. So many people are saying sanctions must go. There is no need of sanctions anymore. You equally have a big number, sizable number in these thousands who have watched you, the millions who are going to watch you. Now, there is one thing that some of the viewers have raised, and I want to read. One of them raised that it is economic mismanagement, lack of economic policies, and corruption which has caused the misery that we see in Zimbabwe. Your comment, quick comment on that. They are accusing the current government of mismanagement, corruption, that is causing the hardships that we see on the ground. One of the viewers by Martin Natagadziza, who is saying so, but many other people are with you, and everybody with us, especially the Pan-African group, worldwide. Now, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I say it's a lack of knowledge when people say that corruption is the reason why Zimbabwe collapsed. And that corruption by this particular administration is the reason why Zimbabwe collapsed, because Zimbabwe was able to run successfully as one of the best economies in Africa under this very same administration for 20 years. And after those 20 years, when Zimbabwe started to take land, after making Zimbabweans the most educated Africans on the continent, the most literate Africans on the continent, only then did we start seeing Zimbabwe dwindle after sanctions were imposed, after debts that were colonial debts were not cancelled, after the debts that were colonial debts became the reason why the IMF was utilized as an instrument to punish Zimbabwe through the Zidera sanctions. But I always say to Zimbabweans, there are more corrupt countries in this world, and the most corrupt of those countries being the ones that have instituted colonialism and slavery, people like America and the British, but they are not collapsing. The Nigerians are not collapsing. India is not collapsing. The Americans who sell their own people GMOs, poisons, so that they can push their petrochemical companies and pharmaceutical companies to make more taxes and more money, spending $2 trillion by making its own people sick to buy medication, is not collapsing. The biggest corruption of all time was the banking crisis that was in 2008. It did not collapse America. America simply went and printed new money and did what is called quantitative easing, and America is back on its feet. That is because corruption is not what brings down countries. Because capitalism itself is the biggest form of corruption because it appropriates resources from one group of people to put it into the hands of a few. The problem in Zimbabwe is that the millionaires and billionaires in Europe, in America, want to appropriate Zimbabwean resources and land, and they are willing to punish Zimbabwe collectively and stop it from international trade in contravention of international law, to stop that country from functioning so that they can be given control of our resources in a form of colonial corruption. And that is the problem. Zimbabweans have got to understand the same way that when we were colonized, when we were slaves, it was not corruption that made Africans poor. It was not corruption that made slaves poor. It was the enslavement. It was the colonialism that made those people poor, because they were removed from economic activity to self-determine, so that they're only reliant on enslavement.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Rutendo. My last question, before I give you your final ending remarks. And I'll be very candid to answer this, yes or no. And then I'll ask you the reasons. Does Africa need elections? Honestly, from the bottom of your heart, does Africa need elections? Are we ready for elections in Africa? Do we need elections? Because every time in every country in Africa, when it is election time, we prepare city mortuary, our mortuary, morticians, extend space. Does Africa need elections? Do we need elections?
Africa does not.
Hold your answers, and I'll give you space. Look at the elections apart from the election of Ghana and South Africa now, which went peacefully, which I don't know whether it was peaceful or whatever. The rest of the elections in Africa that were held between 2016 to today ended up in bloodshed. The rest of them. In Gabon, they killed people. In Gabon, 400 people died. The parliament was burned down. In Gambia, you saw what happened. In Nigeria, out of 84 million people, only 28 million voted. 54 million did not vote. In Uganda, you saw what happened after elections. Dr. Besigye did not want to accept that he lost. In Zimbabwe, even when a constitutional court has ruled, we did not want to accept. In Malawi, in Tanzania, you saw the same. In Kenya, where I am, you saw bloodshed on the streets of Nairobi. Nairobi became ungovernable, the route economically, the country went down. In South Sudan, you saw the guns that are still going on. It's because of lack of elections and the changing the electoral rules. In Egypt, we saw the chairman of African Union, Ali Assisi, himself changing the law to rule until 2032. Does Africa, therefore, Mr. Rutendo, need elections?
No, Africa does not need elections. And the reason why Africa does... I'm assuming you're going to let me go ahead and say why.
Yes, go. Go on your own. You can go.
All right.
You are with me. I feel we are not yet ready, because we go to China, borrow money from China, which does not hold elections. Do you know that China does not hold any elections? They only come once in a year, and there are no members of parliament in China. They only select good-mannered people to come to the General Assembly of the Congress to pass the money that we are eating in Africa today. We are eating Africa money. Even South Africa is eating China money. Look, we eat it from a place where there is no election. We come to use it to hold election where we kill each other on a daily basis, where people buy guns when it is 5 years approaching the end of the other term. People start buying arms to kill each other. That's why I think, for me, we need elections. You go ahead. Those are my reasons.
We do not need elections because Africa has been in existence for at least 9,000 years without elections. And elections were only started even in Europe just in 1800 when the French Revolution took place. And the reason that elections were started in France itself was not to give people the power to rule, but it was actually to give people the illusion that they are ruling, while it is that the elite, the bankers, and the merchants continue to run the lives of those that think that they are selecting their government. And this was proved during time of Napoleon. It has been proved through and through, all the way to even American elections that have been disputed, and American elections that are determined by the Electoral College. So now, another thing that we also need to remember is that in Africa, as long as elections are going to be determined by Western powers accepting our leaders, it means that the leaders that we are choosing, even if they are chosen by the people, if they are not accepted by the West, will not be acceptable, because we don't really live by democracy, but we live by the will of the Western world, because we've adopted their systems and mechanisms in order to rule our own countries. And so every 5 years we are fighting each other on different policies instead of us fighting for national interest. So at the end of the day, we have got political parties that are fighting each other based on who is funding them, based on who is financing them. And we also have an electorate that is given information that is limited by the media. And he who controls the media is the one who feeds the minds of the people who are supposed to choose a leader dependent on the information and propaganda they are fed by the media. Now the question is, who controls the media? In many countries, it's private companies. In many countries, it's private European, Western, American companies that control our media. Here in South Africa, where I live, the media belongs to white people. The same criminals that instituted the crime of against humanity called apartheid are the ones that control the media, that then teaches people's minds on who they are supposed to elect. The same people who never gave back the proceeds of apartheid, the criminals who are holding on to the proceeds of crime, are the ones that influence people's minds to determine who to elect according to the people that are going to maintain the interests of the criminals that robbed the same people. That can't be democracy. That is definitely some form of manipulation. It is actually a form of institutionalized colonialism and neo-colonialism that our people do not even understand. The fact that in Zimbabwe, people actually elect and vote for MDC because their government is under sanctions called for by the same MDC to ensure that that government cannot deliver services and people die, so that they can force people to elect them into power, is a travesty of democracy. And the fact that our people do not understand that there can never be free and fair elections in a country in which an opposition party has called for weapons of economic warfare to kill its people so that they can become the legitimate solution for people to elect, is automatically a sign of how it is that our countries are not democratic, but we're actually run by economic powers and military powers from outside Africa that continue to colonize us.
Thank you very much. Viewers, wherever you are, I would like to give Mr. Rutendo his parting shots. Usually this television gives a parting shot. And we have a video that you made sometime on Africa, why Africa cannot move. We shall be using that video on this struggle for sanctions, of teaching many Africans what to do when you are faced with such conditions. Many Africans have watched you, they are listening, they will play all these videos in our sister companies scattered all over the world in the diaspora. your parting shot on the question of sanctions. When do you think you'll start the movement that you have called Zimbabwe Unite Against United States Sanctions? When is it kicked off? Where can we have massively arrange that in all capital cities of Africa, there is somebody talking on sanctions? Thank you. When can that be done? Parting shot.
We have already started the campaign, and we started the campaign by first of all trying to create visibility and awareness that we exist. We've got an identity. We've got this identity that is spelling out the issues that need to be taken into heart by Zimbabweans. The first is that we're under war sanctions, and those war sanctions are by the United States government, and we as Zimbabweans, as a solution, must unite. So the name itself is supposed to be a message and a call to action to Zimbabweans to say that Zimbabweans, let's unite against against a country that is attacking our nation through economic warfare. Once we've got that, we've already printed t-shirts that we're saying to Zimbabweans, utilize this to spread the message. The name of the institution, the identity, the imagery of that institution already starts to spell out to Zimbabweans that we are at war with the United States, that's using economic weapons, and we as Zimbabweans have got to unite. Another thing we're trying to educate Zimbabweans is that, like has happened in Libya and has happened in Iraq and what is about to happen in Iran, all sanctions are supposed to achieve regime change. And if they do not achieve regime change, those sanctions can be escalated to military warfare, because the warfare has already started with these economic weapons. And when those economic weapons don't achieve the objective, the very same thing that happened in Iraq, the same thing that happened in Libya, will be military occupation or destabilization by utilizing Zimbabweans to fight against each other. To stop that from happening, we as Zimbabweans must unite. And our unity should not just be symbolic unity. It must actually be unity in us collaborating, in investing together. We have a lot of money that comes out of Zimbabwe from the diaspora. We spend a lot of money in Zimbabwe buying Mercedes-Benz, Bentleys and expensive vehicles, just going to show that Zimbabwe does not have an economic problem, but it has got an investment problem. We're not investing our money in the right activities. And part of what this institution exists to tell people is that we must learn to use our money not for consumption, but for production, in order for us to create a legacy for our children and for us to be able to produce what we need. Then with that, we must go to the rest of Africa, like Kwame Nkrumah said, and get us to unite behind these sanctions, but also to emulate what Zimbabwe must do to start collaborating together, pooling our investments together, so that we do not wait for foreign capital, we do not wait for foreign companies to come and create jobs for us, but we can utilize our own resources, our own land, to produce what Africa needs, and to trade what Africa produces for the benefit of Africa and for the control of our resources, and for us to create a resource cartel that controls our resources and takes these resources to the rest of the world on our terms, at our price. That is what is going to bring success to Africa. And the Zimbabwean sanctions are a watershed and an opportunity and milestone that we can utilize to galvanize ourselves and start taking action, because we're already under attack, and our mitigation of that attack is getting together, uniting, and producing our own economic destiny without depending on the Europeans, because they've shown us their ability to sabotage our economies if we don't get our act right.
Okay, thank you very much. The message is very clear, and you have got quite a lot of people from most of the cities, most of the towns, most of the places in the countries in the world, most of them from Zimbabwe. It's a great show, brother. I want to take this opportunity to tell the viewers that this will be repeated several times on South Cameroon Broadcasting partners, our partners, on the satellite system. Those who are watching in all 54 countries in Africa, later on will be repeated. It has been live. If you have missed us, you can see us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram. Everything is there, live. I am told somebody in South Africa was not able to access. I hope Rutendo will help him, because he couldn't open, but you are gonna get a clip right now, which in about 10 minutes, you will have your clip and assess your strength of Pan-Africanism. I'm very, very happy that you have grasped a lot of ideas on the issue of Zimbabwe. Viewers, the Zimbabwe issue touches all of us. It's not only Zimbabweans who should talk about it. The entire Africa should talk about it. The entire Africa should think of Africa Donor Conference. There's a lot of money in Africa, but we take this money up in Europe. The African Union should have brought us together as African Union member states, for member states to contribute towards the lifting of the conditions of the economic status of Zimbabwe. We don't have that unity in Africa. None is planning that. We always run for donor countries, G12, G20, G8, BRICS. All this is where we are running. But we have a lot of countries. If you look at a country like Burundi, Mr. Rutendo is asking for $280,000 to run an election. And it is asking international donors so that when they come in, they control you. Yet Africa has got this money. Yet one banker in Africa, one gentleman has got the money to pay for elections in Burundi. Where is the unity that Africa wants? Zimbabwe cannot suffer when Africa is still present. When we are there and we are seeing what is happening, the people of Zimbabwe need that assistance now, not tomorrow. Need us to push for sanctions to be removed. Everywhere, wherever you are in Seattle, whether you are in Washington, whether in Michigan, whether you are in Carolina, whether you are in Minneapolis, whether you are which state, which city of US, you must say something positive to remove sanctions against the people of Zimbabwe. These actions are not hurting the leaders. Leaders can fly and eat in any hotel in Malaysia, in Singapore. But the ordinary citizens from Rupani, ordinary citizens from Kariba, ordinary citizens from Bindura, ordinary citizens from all those places, Marondera, all those places of Zimbabwe, Chinoi, ordinary citizens have traveled that vast country of Zimbabwe. Ordinary citizens from Kaduma and all those places, they cannot eat. They cannot go to Singapore to eat. Leaders can go. Therefore, sanctions are not hurting the people that you send them on. Sanctions are hurting the people of Zimbabwe. And the ambassador in Zimbabwe should not sit on the biggest compound in Africa, not trying to help us to take these sanctions away. No. The younger generation of Zimbabwe must rise up and say no to sanctions. They have to rise up. United States of America has the biggest compound of embassy in Zimbabwe. What does it collect? It collects dead bodies. It's collecting dead bodies of Zimbabweans who are dying of hunger, and you put sanctions on them. Yet we have given you the biggest land on this planet of Africa continent to build an embassy. People must stand up to defend your country. That is your country. Give up these differences. Hunger is not choosing who to kill. Hunger kills MDC. Hunger kills ZANU-PF. Hunger is not choosing. Disease has not chosen whom to kill. Disease kills all of you. You are Zimbabweans. You must say no to sanctions. You don't go to look for them. Any leader who flies to Europe, who flies to Washington to go and seek sanctions to finish his people is myopic, is a demagogue who should not be allowed to exist among the people of Zimbabwe. Thank you very much. Viewers, I've added a message. I think I'm going to be one of your serious organizers down in Nairobi. And I hope that message resonates very well with the people. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the President of Zimbabwe, Idi Mnangagwa, to keep that unity, to push slowly, slowly, don't give up. Time is coming. Salvation will come. Nothing is difficult. Colonialism went. Sanctions cannot defeat us. On that note, your last word, sir. Your last word in the hand of Africa. What do you say? You can say it in your language for your people. You can now speak a bit of Shona on the very whatever language you can. Do it now. The station is there for you.
Mutatenda zvikuru. Thank you very much. Tinoti susu vana veZimbabwe ngatibatane. Tiri vana vaMutapa. Ngatibatane zvakare zvanga zvakaita madzibaba edu, madzitateguru edu, tivake nyika yedu. And I would also like to say to the diaspora of Africans out there, it is our responsibility to invite you into Africa to come and invest in our countries. The reason we are being fought is because of the resources, the soils of our land that are so rich in wealth. We want to invite African Americans, Brazilians, Africans in the United Kingdom and in Europe for you to come and take up the opportunity of investing in Africa right now. While Zimbabwe is under sanctions, this is the time to come in when there's no Europeans to take the opportunity. Put your money into Zimbabwe, invest in mining, invest in agriculture, and prosper. Take that paper money that you're holding in America that has no real value and put it into land, put it into a mine, put it into processing resources, putting into manufacturing in Africa so that you can begin to create a continent that you can come back to and one that can protect you from the Americans and the right-wing racist militaries and army and police officers that you're finding in the rest of the diaspora. This is the time for Africa to unite. Zimbabwe is a milestone for us to unite around, to coalesce around, to unite, and to learn how to be one people. Thank you. Tatenda.
Tatenda, Baba. But before you go, listen to this song. Listen to this song. This song is from Democratic Republic of Congo. This song is a revolutionary song that kept Zimbabweans who fought for the liberation of Zimbabwe from Ian Smith. It kept us in Tanzania together united. I want you to listen to this song. It is coming.
Africa,
very much, viewers. That was People's Court on sanctions on Zimbabwe. I want to thank the millions that have watched across the world, those who will watch later. Thank you very much. Keep on supporting the people of Zimbabwe. Keep the support. Keep the weight behind the government of Zimbabwe. Give them a chance to stand, to be able to defend their country against the sanctions imposed by the United States of America. May God bless all of you until 6 p.m. when we return with my opinion. Myself and Tawish will be running the show, my opinion on the situation of in Kenya. Thank you very much. 6 p.m. East African Standard Time. We are still on the show, coming right from Nairobi. God bless you. God bless Africa. God keep all of you. Struggle for Africa. Keep united. Political unity is the only answer against neo-colonialism. God bless you. This station is therefore for Africa, with Africa, by Africa. Ciao.
Peace must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.